Hello, everyone, and you're all very welcome. My name is John Malloy, and I'm a lecturer in the ATU in the Mayo campus in Castlebar. And what I want to do is to talk to you about landscape and representations of it from various different points of view. And I'm going to use lots of different examples and ideas. So I'm going to, first of all, share my screen. Uh, Okay, sorry, just to get set up there. Um, the reason I'm doing this is I'm doing this way is to enable the subtitles here that they'll be live on the screen in front of me. Um, yeah, so landscape and representation. This is an image of the area just up the road from where I live. And what I want to do today is to explore some of the things that have shaped and formed that landscape and our understanding of that landscape. And what I've done is I've broken it into four key sections. The first is an overview of landscape and art with an introduction to some ideas around the notion of the sublime and the picturesque, which originated as kind of philosophical approaches to the landscape in the 18th century. And that's a particularly important period of time in terms of what I'm trying to do. Then a look at landscape and colonialism, particularly with the focus on Ireland. There will be quite a bit of focus on Ireland, but I will try to explain as much as I can a little bit about the history of Ireland within this overall framework. Then landscape and history into the modern era, and then finally an exploration of landscape and power, again as represented in art and primarily with an Irish focus. So I'm going to go straight into it. This is an image by Karen Knorr, and the notion of a connoisseur of the landscape. So, what is a landscape? The first thing to remember is that a landskip was a Dutch term for paintings of landed estates in the countryside, originating in the 17th century, so in the 1600s. So that's really the core idea, that this notion of an area of property that was owned by somebody and then was worthy of representation, a kind of a portrait of somebody's property. And this became a genre in itself, an art form in itself. And that idea spread widely across Europe. And the word landscape became landscape in English and Landschaft in German and so on. So this idea caught on very quickly. But if we mention the idea of ownership, we're immediately into issues of conflict. And this is a kind of a description, really, of landscape from John Brinkerhoff Jackson, who is an American theorist, describes it as a landscape like a language is the field of perpetual conflict and compromise between what's established by authority and what the vernacular insists upon preferring. Um, One of the things he talks about is the idea of town planning, for example, where you might have a town square and the local planner might lay it out beautifully with grass and so on and has a path that meanders a certain way through it. But people will insist on crossing by the shortest route. And that's this contestation between the established authoritarian path, so to speak, and the vernacular path. So there is that contest, he argues. The other big issue that I want us to consider is the idea of nature. And again, nature becomes a major theme in European thinking around the time of the emergence of landscape as an idea. So, in particular, during the idea of the Enlightenment, the period of the Enlightenment, you get lots of philosophers beginning to think about what is nature and what is the difference between nature and culture. What is the human role in regard to nature? Those kinds of ideas. So, this is The Beauty of Rural Ireland. This is a card by Dominic Stevens, who is an Irish architect. It's project from quite a while ago, but it's interesting in terms of what we're trying to do. So on the back of this image, he has the description: the beauty of rural Ireland, forests cleared, stones collected, crops sown, weeds suppressed, crops harvested, hay made, manure collected, fertilizer spread, dwellings built, ditches dug, hedgerows grown, walls built, roads made, forests planted, barns erected. And the conclusion then is Ireland's rural landscape is as man made as the skyline of Manhattan. So that's the core idea. We tend to think of natural beauty within the rural landscape. And then when we begin to delve into it a little bit more, we begin to understand that actually these are human creations, these landscapes. So that's a theme I want us to think about a bit. I'm going to approach it another way. This is work by Maria Teresa Alves, who is a Brazilian artist, and she's been working on the project Seeds of Change for many, many years. And the idea is to bring out a kind of a secret history and geography of plants. And one of the things that she realized is that seeds were transported in the ballast of ships. The ballast is often stones, but sometimes there would be soil as well to weigh the boat, to steady the boat after maybe a heavy cargo has been unloaded, but the boat needs to be kept roughly the same weight. So they use ballast to even out the boat. So the ballast would be transported and then removed when it arrives to the port where the cargo is to replace the ballast. Some of these seeds have been brought back to life after several hundred years. And her argument is that this gives a kind of a cognitive cartography of globalization and an alternative history of migration, human migration. So, for example, gardeners near Finnish port of Reposari have been proudly intending exotic plants. They had no idea what these plants they were looking after were. For many, many years. In Liverpool, ballast was used to build the foundation for new roads. So plants from particularly West Africa, but also from Asia and the Americans, could still be found sprouting from cracks in corners of the city. So the idea then, could you explore the slave trade as an environmental issue, as a means of bringing plants with it that perhaps have an environmental impact, and so on and so on. So that kind of idea. She worked with the German designer Gitte Geschwender on the development of a floating garden on a barge in Bristol Harbour in the west of England. And again, using the kinds of foreign seeds that were once mixed up in the ship's ballast before being dumped in the river. And again, Bristol Harbour, people might remember from a couple of years ago during the Black Lives Matters protest, they threw the statue of the slave trader Colston into the river. It was a major slave trading city. So this idea that the trade in people enslaving other people also had an environmental impact. So she's just using that as a kind of a metaphor, in a sense, for what has happened in human history. Okay, so let's think about that. We've already raised a couple of issues. We've talked about the idea of ownership. We've talked about the idea of nature. We've talked about the idea of the impact of migration and enslavement. So clearly, there's a lot going on in this seemingly simple concept of landscape. And one of the big ideas that I want us to look at is the notion of what's known as romanticism. And romanticism is an idea that really began to emerge as kind of a sensibility in the late 18th century. And this is really the aftermath of the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, all of that kind of period. You get a strong drive towards the beginnings of what we might call cultural nationalism. And there's a real sense of kind of harking back to the past. And this was particularly strong in Germany. Germany was not a united country. It was not to be unified until 1871. And you had this confederation, really, a kind of a tax unification, so to speak, of various little principalities and duchies and small kingdoms, but they shared the same system of customs and taxes. But more importantly, they shared the same language and they shared the same basic cultural outlook. But key to that cultural outlook was a sense of loss. And that's one of the things. This is a painting by Caspar David Friedrich, who is probably the archetypal romantic painter of Germany in that period. And one of the key themes that keeps coming up is the notion of Germany as an oak tree that is, in a sense, decayed or dying. So that kind of notion. So you can see the tree with the broken branches and the exposed roots here, the moon going down, the sense of decline. This is a key issue. Okay, so let's look a little bit more in detail at romanticism. It was, excuse me, first defined as an aesthetic in literary criticism around 1800. and then gained momentum as an artistic movement in France, in Britain, and Germany in the early decades of the 19th century and flourished until at least the mid 19th century. And the origins of it are in reaction to the collapse of the Enlightenment values of reason and order in what was seen as the terror and the rupture of the French Revolution of 1789. This combined with the hatred of the Industrial Revolution, and that was for several reasons, and I'll get into that in a second. Um, and the emphasis, particularly in terms of art and literature, was on the imagination and on emotion. And these were to be felt most keenly in the presence of nature and in the presence of the sublime. And the sublime is a philosophical idea that emerged in, again, the mid 18th century before the French Revolution, but took on major importance, particularly in art historical terms, in the post revolutionary period, the first half of the 19th century in particular. So English and French romantic thought was very much dominated by the sublime, whereas German romanticism tended to be slightly different, heavily influenced by philosophical idealism, the notion that the material reality is not real, in a sense that the world is ideal, particularly if you think of philosophers like Schopenhauer and so on. But also there was a strand of nature mysticism in terms of people like Goethe and Schelling. So this Naturphilosophie, that idea became very strong in Germany. Um, just to go back to this idea of the hatred of the Industrial Revolution, this was particularly sharply felt in Britain, primarily in England. Um, this is fairly obvious that this would happen there, in a sense that this was the first country to industrialize on a large scale, and in particular with the coal industry and the development of steam engines. um, you got a lot of pollution very suddenly in lots of areas, but more importantly, the agricultural population, large sectors of the agricultural population became displaced as food began to be imported from elsewhere. There had been kind of an idea that there had been an agricultural revolution in Britain during the 18th century and that somehow food production had become much more efficient. But more recent research has shown that actually agricultural production on the island of Great Britain declined, and instead more agricultural produce was being imported from countries like Ireland, but also from places like India, and then later on, obviously, goods like cotton from the US and so on. So you had this displaced agricultural population that then crowded into the cities, excuse me, and formed a new class of people, the industrial workers, the famous proletariat of Marxist thinking. So that kind of idea, this set about a very uncertain time, a feeling of rapid change, a certain sense of threat among sectors of the population, and a reaction built in. And that reaction became baked in as part of Romanticism. And one of the things about Romanticism is the idea of the worship of the rural. And this connects again with the idea of the landscape, the notion of a kind of a flight from modernity, all of that kind of thing. So you get this image of the strong, happy family working busily on their farm in the middle of this beautiful landscape. That idea. So we have an association of landscape with rural. And again, we have another opposition being set up between this rural landscape and the industrial urban world of modernity. So somehow the rural landscape is non-modern. It's on some level anti-modern, and it becomes, in certain sectors of the romantic imagination, more authentic, more real for that. It's somehow timeless. And that's a theme, again, we'll come back on. So first of all, let's think about rural. So of or pertaining to or characteristic of the country or country life existing or performed in the country, agricultural, pastoral, those kind of terms. And those are kind of all fairly benign. Then you have it in terms of how people are governed. So resident or working in the country of an official body and so on. But then we get into this tension between the urban and rural in the third category of this definition. So characteristic or suggestive of country people, rustic, simple, frequently derogatory, of art or literary style, etc., befitting the country or a pastoral subject, unpolished, plain. So we can immediately see how, on the one hand, the city is seen as sophisticated, as enlightened, and so on, whereas the country people are simple and plain and they're unpolished. But that becomes a virtue in certain eyes. And this painting, for example, is a German painting from 1938 by Karl Alexander Flügel, who was a German painter actively involved with the Nazi Party. And this is the kind of imagery that was widely associated with the Nazi regime in Germany. It's the idea of Lebensraum, this notion of living space. Nazism as an ideology is often associated with what might be termed reactionary modernism, the notion that really the cities are somehow corrupt and decadent, and the people who live in these cities, these particularly the proletarian people, are decadent, and the strong, healthy, Aryan white Germans are the people who are living in the countryside. But the problem for those strong, blue-eyed, blonde Germans is that they need more room. So Germany needed then, in theory, to clear the land to the east and to create living space. That's the notion. And then these happy farming families would have loads of space to farm their land in this productive way compared to the inferior people who supposedly are living there already and who just need to be moved out of the way. So that idea, that notion that the rural space then becomes a release valve, so to speak, for modernity, that's kind of a key idea. Part of that Nazi project included, for example, deporting about 100,000 people in eastern Poland to make a reserve for the European bison. So there's this kind of environmental fascism. We let's call a spade in that sense. That's really a key element of the overall Nazi ideology, which, as I said, can be termed this kind of reactionary modernism, anti-urban ideology. We'll return briefly to Caspar David Friedrich. This is an image by him, The Wanderer Above the Sea of Mist, and it's no accident that Friedrich was Hitler's favorite painter. This landscape is very commonly used to epitomize the idea of the sublime. So I just want to explain the notion of the sublime for a minute. It names experiences like violent storms or huge buildings which seem to overwhelm us. And it's either mainly mathematical, when our ability to understand it is overwhelmed by size. If we're standing on the street and we're looking up at some huge skyscraper and it looks almost like it's falling through the sky on top of us, or it's dynamical. So we've got the mathematical sublime and we've got the dynamical sublime. And the dynamical sublime is when our ability to will or to resist is overwhelmed by force. And usually the example is the storm, but it can also be things like an avalanche or a cliff or something like that. One of the problems for Kant, who is the main philosopher of the sublime in the late 18th century, Immanuel Kant, German philosopher originally from Königsberg, which is now Kaliningrad, which is part of Russian territory. But the big problem was he had this notion that we had to understand nature as somehow purposive, that nature had a purpose. And this experience of the sublime seems to contradict this principle of the purposiveness of nature. So you'd expect the feeling of being overwhelmed to be also accompanied by a feeling of fear, or at least discomfort. And yet we know that the sublime is one of our most pleasurable experiences. People love standing on the top of cliffs, which would seem to be irrational. Why do we get pleasure out of this? This would seem to be a crazy thing to do. So Kant, he looked around to find previous bits of writing on the idea of the sublime. The sublime is an idea that goes back to Roman thought. But there was a famous essay from the late 1750s written by Edmund Burke in Trinity College in Dublin on the origins of our ideas of the picturesque and the sublime. And the argument in it really is that the storm or the building is not actually the real object of our experience of the sublime at all. Instead, what's properly sublime are in fact our ideas of reason, and in particular the ideas of absolute totality or absolute freedom. However huge the building, we know that the building is tiny compared to absolute totality, compared to the totality of space. This building is minuscule. However powerful the storm, again, it's nothing compared to absolute freedom. So the sublime freedom, or sorry, the sublime feeling, therefore, is a kind of rapid alternation, this flicking between the fear of the overwhelming and this pleasure in seeing that overwhelming thing itself being overwhelmed by our own awareness of the world around us, of the bigger world. So here we have Hannibal and his army crossing the Alps in an image by the English artist James W. Turner, very famous 19th century artist. And again, his work fully within this English romantic tradition and heading towards almost an abstraction. The human is reduced to tiny in scale, and the natural forces become abstract and almost overwhelming. So the argument then that Kant has is that the sublime experience is actually purposive after all. It reduces our sense of our importance, but that links us to our feelings about our own morality. It would not be possible. The sublime experience, he says, would not be possible if humans hadn't received a moral training that taught them to recognize the importance of our own faculty of reason. In other words, we must belong to a moral culture. So, on the one hand, we have this moment of fear, as can be seen here, but there's also a moment of wonder, of awe. And this is the awe in the face of God, if you want to call it that, but this notion that there's a moral culture. I mean, Kant would have put it in religious terms in that sense. This is a painting by Philip James de Loutherbourg. Originally, he came from Belgium and then worked mainly in England, but also did some work in Ireland, and was a fantastic showman, in many ways a forerunner of the cinema. And trying to convey this feeling of the sublime was really an obsession with him throughout his work. So that's why I chose his stuff there. Now, I did mention that in Edmund Burke's essay, he considered two elements, both the sublime but also the picturesque. So just to look at the picturesque very briefly, in the late 18th century, England, tastes in landscape changed very dramatically. Again, the Industrial Revolution, but also with the wars on the continent of Europe between Napoleonic France and particularly England and the other ancient regimes, there was a growth in so-called home tourism, particularly the lake districts of northern England. So a new aesthetic emerged. You couldn't be looking for the dramatic landscape of the Alps. It was now picturesque scenery and fine prospects. So there was a new attitude. This is a parody of this. This is Dr. Syntax in Search of the Picturesque. It's a satirical poem, but it became a huge hit. And in many ways, he was one of the first cartoon characters in British literature. But the idea of the picturesque derived from a lot of 17th century notions of landscape. And one of the things in particular was the work of somebody like Claude Lorraine, but also people like Salvatore Rosa, people like that. And the notion that the landscape had a kind of an underlying structure to it. So you have the mountains in the distance, you have some water and maybe a road or a bridge in the middle ground. You have some ruins, some sense of decay, large trees framing a scene, and then usually some little bit of human story in the foreground. And this became a kind of a way of creating these kind of picturesque images. And it became quite formulaic. One of the things was that the views shouldn't be completely shaped and organized by human intervention. This was a key feature. And estates would be designed with landscape gardeners who would lay out the landscape in such a way that it looked natural. That was a core idea. So the human intervention was hidden by means of, for example, separating fields by digging trenches, so-called ha-has, that would fool you. You would think there's no barrier in the landscape, but actually there is, so the animals are kept out, that kind of idea. And they conform to the rules of composition, of tonality and balance, again, established by the 17th century artists. So this kind of paradox, really, using systems to produce the picturesque. And then in particular, its association with watercolor and feminine painting led it to being completely ridiculed as a style. And this can be seen in novels like Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey or poems as we've seen Dr. Syntax. The image is an image by Alexander Cousins, and it's from a technique that he developed of using crumpled paper to press images onto paper, and then they could be used as a start for an imaginary landscape in order to explore the rules of the picturesque. It's a way of teaching people how to develop picturesque images. That was kind of the core idea. The sublime as an idea has survived better than the picturesque. So I want to just read this quote here first. I came to know the cartographer, artist and writer Tim Robinson, who spent 40 years documenting the terrain of the west of Ireland, a region where, as he puts it, the landscape speaks Irish. Robinson's belief in the importance of the language we breathe as part of our frontage onto the natural world has been inspiring to me, as has been his commitment to recording subtleties of usage and history in Irish place names before they are lost forever. Scriss Bull in Nevadog, the open track to the pasture of the lapwings. Esker, a ridge of glacial deposits marking the course of a river that flowed under the ice of the last glaciation. So this is Robert Macfarlane, who is a very famous nature writer, landscape writer. And there is this idea, again, that there's somehow things are lost forever in the countryside, but there's also somehow a connection to identity and to language in landscape that is somehow very essential, using the word essential. There are a couple of contradictions here. I mean, the most obvious one is that Tim Robinson, the person who he argues that the landscape speaks Irish, was in fact English. But anyway, that's another whole story. This is a piece of work by a contemporary artist, Martina Coyle, and it was a public art commission on the Erris Peninsula, which is in the northwest of Mayo. Which would be about 30 miles from the Mayo campus of the ATU. And this was a video project. So the way it was displayed was there was split screen with two simultaneous videos showing, and then the soundtrack was people reciting the place names of the locality in Irish. So, you know, on Faldov and things like that. The idea is that you have this empty landscape, but then again, you have this authenticity of the Irish language being reflected over that. So this is kind of a theme. This is not just Macfarlane dreaming up this notion. This is absolutely a theme within Irish culture and within kind of the production of art. And this has been picked up on by various people, in particular Kathleen Jamie, who is a Scottish poet. And again, this is a quotation from her from the London Review of Books. There are no meetings, no encounters with intrusive folk. It is all truly empty, secret and luscious. From Sutherland to the Burn, even to Dorset and Essex, the book reveals a sense of beguiling solitude. There are no other voices, no Welsh or Irish or differently accented English. It has to be thus, of course, because if we start blethering to the locals, the conceit of empty wild will be lost. So there has to be silence, an avoidance of voices other than the authors, just wind in the trees or waves, the cry of the curlew. We see him swimming, climbing, looking, feeling, hearing, responding, being sensitive. And because almost no one else speaks, this begins to feel like an appropriation, as if the land had been taken from us and offered back in a different language and tone and attitude. Because it is land we're talking about, this leads to an unfortunate sense that we're in the company, however engaging, of another owner, or if not an owner, certainly a single mediator. So again, this is this theme of who mediates the landscape for us. And again, remember this idea of landscape reflecting the notion of property in early capitalist Holland in the 17th century. So this idea, so we need to, again, engage with this kind of thought a little bit more. So what I want to do is just sidetrack very slightly into that idea of land and ownership and colonialism, and a particular debate that's become very strong, especially in Ireland in the last few years, around the notion of native versus alien species. So I have a few sources here, and they'll all be in the reading list as well anyway. But classifying species as either native or alien is central to nature conservation practice. But there are fractious, long-standing debates between those who champion native nature and those who advocate a more inclusive cosmopolitan approach. Labeling a species native implies that it is in its rightful place, while alien implies the converse, a species out of bounds, out of place, and out of control. But nativeness is not really a sign of evolutionary fitness. It simply describes the species which happen to arrive and flourish first. And in Ireland, we tend to have kind of an arbitrary cutoff around the end of the last ice age, and things that were there then are native, and somehow things that came after, say within early in the last 2 millennia, somehow they're not. So, for example, beech trees are not classified as native in Ireland, even though they have been here for well over 1,000 years and are well adapted to the landscape and do host a myriad of insects and wildlife and so on. So where what are we looking at here in this native alien debate is the question. So Warren argues that the native paradigm perpetuates three myths. First of all, the romantic conception of the balance of nature, despite the overall shift to non-equilibrium thinking in many parts of ecology. That's one. So we have this kind of essentializing of a certain stage of nature as being the true, real Ireland or whatever country it might be. Okay, that's one. Then we have this pre-Darwinian conceptual separation of human beings from nature, such that anthropogenic species dispersal renders nature unnatural. So if things are brought in by humans or just happen to accompany humans, somehow they're outside this realm of this perfect nature that the romantic vision has created. And then the third element of this is the new worlds encountered by the European explorers, which obviously consisted of primeval or unhumanized environments. And there was this kind of notion of wild nature in many parts of the world. And the word that's often used to describe people who were to be colonized was savage. And this is a theme in Irish culture too. Um, One of the peculiarities of Irish culture is obviously that Ireland is one of the few European countries that was in itself colonized in very much the classic colonial pattern. So this is a book from 1581. This image is taken from a book, and it's celebrating the victories of the English Lord Deputy of Ireland, Sir Henry Sidney, during the Tudor conquest of Ireland. There have been several phases to the invasion of Ireland. The Normans had come in the 1160s, but by the 15th century, that conquest had largely faded away, and there had been a resurgence of Irish culture. Several factors played into that, one being the Black Death, focused in the few English based towns, well, Anglo-Norman towns that were there at the time. And then secondly, just the incapacity of the English state to be able to control Ireland at the time. With the Reformation and the increased power of the Tudor monarchy in particular, there became an increased focus on reconquering Ireland. And the notion was the pacification of Ireland. And huge resources were put in, and the country was firmly subdued, so to speak, by the end of the 17th century. So the 16th century was this phase of the Tudor conquest really getting going. By the time of Queen Elizabeth, there was the idea of removing the native people and creating plantations of settlers, of colonists. So the image depicts Rory O'Gomore, who rebelled following the Mullaghmast massacre of 1577. In 1577, there was a meeting organized on New Year's Day by Francis Cosby, who was one of these new English warlords, I suppose we could call him, and Sir Henry Sidney, with the local chiefs and their Derb Fine. The Derb Fine is everybody who shares a common grandfather, and the new chieftains in an Irish tribe would be elected from that people who shared the common grandfather. They were assembled together during a supposed priest conference, but it was actually an ambush. But Rory managed to escape and survived in the forest, and he's depicted as a wood kern, and oh, how miserable I am, and so on, and it goes badly for me too, says the poor dog. So that idea that he is in refuge in the forest, dressed in his Irish mantle. He's accompanied by his wolfhound. So he is the indigenous figure in wild nature. That's the image. And the Woodkerns were displaced native Irish. Um, and they had existed from the beginning of the invasions by the Anglo-Normans. So as early as 1297, the gentry were required by law to keep the roads clear of fallen and growing trees. The idea that there would be space beside all the roads, that an ambush could be avoided. There is a theory, there's a distinct minority, an ethnic minority officially recognized as such, the Irish travellers, who traditionally were nomadic. There's about 30,000 of a population, and genetically they have separated out from the mainstream Irish population in the 16th century. And there is an argument that the Woodkern are therefore one possible origin for travellers as a distinct group within the Irish population. Okay, I mentioned Francis Cosby was involved in this ambush in 1577. He was killed 3 years later in the Battle of Glenmalure. So he was an English soldier, basically. But part of the idea was that these men were adventurers and they would get land and estates in Ireland. And the land that he was offered was the lands of a disused abbey, like the abbeys had been dissolved by the Henry VIII during the Reformation. So this land was granted to Francis Cosby in 1562. Um, his son and another Francis were later on killed by the O'Moores. So again, the native people were fighting hard to try and retain their land. Subsequently, the land was entirely subdued in the 17th century. And by 1699, I have a quote from Poole Cosby, who was one of the descendants. My father, when he married, my mother set up housekeeping at Stradbally, and the year after he married, he built the big house. That is the hall, big staircase, and big parlour. My grandfather Poole gave him all the timber and 500 deal boards to build it. He then planted a good many ditches and trees, made the south hedge of the avenue, enclosed the kitchen garden and the new orchard, and set the hedges around him. Now, one of the things about this is, as we've seen, O'Moore took refuge in the forest. Ireland in the 16th century had a large covering of forest, but both for the wars of the 16th century, but more particularly the wars of the 17th century, much of that timber was cut down. The land was cleared to get rid of the population of the local people. Um, Famously, Oliver Cromwell, who was in charge in Ireland during the 1650s, issued a declaration that the native Irish had to get to Hell or to Connacht, in other words, the western part of the country. And the better land, and in particularly these forested areas, were reserved for the English. Um, the trees were felled for ships, for defensive wars, and so on and so on. And then these estates were replanted. And one of the things about this replanting is that many of the trees, including the native oaks, were in fact purchased in Holland. Native oaks, again, in scare quotes. Um, this period, 1699, there had been the Williamite Wars in Ireland in the 1690s, and this put King William of Orange, who came from the Netherlands, on the throne of England because he was a Protestant. So again, sectarianism between Catholic and Protestant played a major part in the wars of the 17th century. Um, this had a huge knock-on effect on Irish culture. There's a very famous poem which everybody in Ireland learns in school, Kilcash. Cad a dhéanamh míad feasta gan naimid tá dearan na cuiltear lár, níl trochttar Kilcash nor a teaghlach is ní chlinfar a cling go brá. Now what will we do for timber with the last of the woods laid low? There's no talk of Kilcash or its household, its bell will be struck no more. This poem was actually written in the 19th century. but it laments the loss of the trees at the Kilcash estate in County Tipperary. The final trees were sold in 1797 and 1801, but it actually refers to the world of the 17th century and the world of the so-called Old English, who were originally English settlers but who remained Catholic during the Reformation and then as a result sided with the Irish. So they were on the wrong side of both the Confederate Wars and the Williamite Wars, which I've already mentioned, where William of Orange took over as British king. And this is the period when most of the forests were destroyed in Ireland. Timber was required for warfare. The other big element was for iron production to make charcoal, and then the English Navy. There was a lot of oak in Ireland, and that oak was used particularly for making the keels of the English ships. So that's kind of the idea. So let's just think a little bit again about this idea of native and alien. So we talked about nativeness and alienness developing in conjunction with the nationalization of nature and the naturalization of the nation, and ecological and political nationalistic narratives being conflated as a result. But key to these are these conflicts between civilization and nature and the use of nature to erase history. So we saw the image of Rory O'Moore. The word that was used to describe the Irish at the time in English routinely was savage. They were either the savage Irish or they were the wild Irish. Either or. It was kind of interchangeable. And they were described, and Irish culture was described in very similar terms to the cultures that the same British colonials, people like Walter Raleigh, running a colony in the south of Ireland, in the Munster plantation, and also running Virginia in what's now the USA. So that idea, the very same people were involved in this process of colonization on both sides of the Atlantic. And so the people who were being colonized were treated in exactly the same way. This is a painting by Albert Eckhout. He was a Dutch painter, one of the first European artists to paint scenes from the Americas. And he was with the Dutch Governor General of Dutch Brazil to record the country's landscape, inhabitants, flora, and fauna. And it reflects obviously European stereotypes of indigenous American cannibalism. There's a sense of distance created for us by the way she seems to be just wandering the forest, foraging for human body parts. And then that's accentuated by the exoticism of the tree behind her, the carao pods on the tree. And it's part of a series depicting a so-called hierarchy of civility among the population of Brazil, the so-called casta paintings. These became very popular genre paintings in the New World. But we had again, in Ireland, we had the exact same idea. There's a famous map from around 1611, the map of Ireland. And on the side of the map are images of the wild and civil Irish. So there's the wild Irish at the bottom, the civil Irish, and then the English gentry are above. So again, we have this very same idea of the hierarchy of civility becoming a real theme in this 7th century age of colonialism. It's not just about colonialism in a way, because this is another version of that kind of landscape and history. This is down in the Bieszczady National Park, which is down in the very southeast corner of Poland, squeezed between Ukraine and Slovakia. And Operation Vistula in 1947 saw the forced resettlement of about 150,000 mountain people, Ukrainians, Russians, Boykos, Lemkos, from the southeastern provinces of Poland just after the war to the territories that had been recovered from Germany in western Poland. The idea was to crush support for any Ukrainian partisans that were still hanging around in the Podgorze, Przemysl, and Bieszczady and Beskidnitsky regions. So that idea. So even communities that didn't support the partisans, mixed families, Lemkos who had been serving in the Red Army, even loyalist Communist Party members who had been involved in previous deportations, they were all kicked out and forcibly resettled, and the area became depopulated. The only people remaining were a few forest workers. By 1973, this area became the Biashada National Park. And it's about 300 square kilometres, mostly beech forest, which has grown over the former villages and farmland. So when you walk through the forest, you will occasionally encounter human remains in terms of graveyards, very occasionally a street lamp. There are some abandoned train stations, and so on and so on. It's currently very sparsely populated, less than one person per kilometre. And it is a large area and includes areas in Slovakia and Ukraine. So we have this idea of, again, this is a nature reserve, but it was a human zone, but they were the wrong type of people, so they needed to be moved on. That idea, that's kind of at the core of this. We see the same thing happening in the Middle East. So beginning in the 1970s around Jerusalem, thousands of acres of forest were planted by the Jewish National Fund in order to camouflage destroyed Palestinian villages and to create a new authentic biblical landscape. And Rafa Segal and A.L. Weizmann argue that the very thing that renders the landscape biblical or pastoral, its traditional inhabitants and cultivation in terraces, olive orchards, and the presence of livestock, is produced by the Palestinians, who the Jewish settlers came to replace. And yet, the very people who came to cultivate the green olive orchards and render the landscape biblical are themselves excluded from the panorama. The Palestinians are there to produce the scenery and then disappear. The gaze that sees a pastoral biblical landscape does not register what it does not want to see. It is a visual exclusion that seeks a physical exclusion. Settlers can thus see only other settlements, avoid those of the Palestinian towns and villages, and feel that they have truly arrived as the people without land to the land without people. So again, we have this mythology of the land and the ownership of the land, and this notion of the right kind of people and the wrong kind of people, and who gets to control the representation and the literal shaping of the land. So those ideas are really at the heart of what I'm trying to get at in this talk. In Africa, we can see the same kind of process going on. The rhetoric around degrees of civility in the early modern period in colonial settings hinged on the conflict between nature and culture, usually, again, wild or civilized rather than urban or rural. And again, the landscape art of those kind of early periods where man brings order to unruly nature. But in his book, The Invention of Green Colonialism, Guillaume Blanc, French environmental historian, argues that this division is still very much alive and informs what he calls the naturalization of Africa. By naturalization, I am referring to the dehumanization of Africa, a process which involves turning territories into national parks, banning agriculture in these areas, evicting people from their homes and getting rid of their fields and grazing land in order to create a supposedly natural world in which people are absent. And this battle for a phantom Africa has no impact whatsoever on the destruction of biodiversity. One of the things he's very critical of is the impact that actually removing the herders has on some of the trees and the forest landscape that pre-exists the invention of the park, and how actually that landscape begins to fall apart once the herders are removed. And again, the impact of that removal of people and their animals on the landscape, and what is it we're actually trying to conserve becomes then the core question. So he says it's actually based on, again, this romantic dream, the vision of this some kind of paradise or Eden before filthy modernity got involved. So that kind of notion. So just to quote the beginning of the book, this story begins with a dream, the dream of Africa. Virgin forests, majestic mountains surrounded by savannas, lush oases, vast empty plains, sorry, apologies for the typos, vast empty plains marked by the rhythms of animal life, where lions, elephants, giraffes, and rhinoceroses reign as lords of nature, far from civilization. All of us carry such images in our head. Images suffused with a sense of eternity, a reassuring emotion in the face of the damage being inflicted everywhere else in the world by modernity, our modernity. But this Africa does not exist. It has never existed. And the problem is that we have convinced ourselves of the opposite. The more nature disappears in the West, the more we fantasize about it in Africa. The more we destroy nature here, the more energetically we try to save it there. So that idea, that's at the core of this kind of notion, is this debate around landscape and power. Um, One of the key hinges of European history is the Black Death. The Black Death struck Europe in the 1340s, round about 1347, 1348. This is the Sala di Nova from the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena. And this is really the seat of local power. And it is a portrait of the city under two modes, one of good government and one of bad government. But one of the key ideas that's in the depiction of the city by Lorenzetti is the situation of the city in the landscape. It is the first kind of notion, in a sense, of depicting the city in what we might term an extractive landscape. So we can see how the peasants are out in the fields, they're thrashing the wheat, um, they're bringing in the crops, they're harvesting, and so on and so on. Lots of different activities going on at the same time. And they're bringing the grain in to the city. They're also bringing in animals into the city. So these goods are being extracted from the landscape and brought to the city, and the city depends on this. You also have the nobles who are engaging in their sport and they're trampling over the crops at the same time, which is equally a display of power. So we need to think about this. This is kind of at the core of some of our attitudes of what it means to be rural, what is the landscape, what is the outdoors, this kind of idea. Um, I've mentioned the Irish example a few times, and this is a tour in Ireland by Richard Twiss from 1776, an English gentleman touring Ireland. And I mentioned earlier how in the 17th century, the traditional Irish families who were in charge of all this kind of territory were forced to move westwards into Connacht, and the slogan being to hell or to Connacht. And Connacht is the west of the country, and as you can see, it's quite heavily populated the rest of the country, but there are relatively few towns and place names in Connacht. And tours of Ireland usually did include the West, but Twiss in particular said, neither did I go into that quarter of Ireland called Connacht, which comprehends the counties of Mayo, Sligo, Leitrim, Roscommon and Galway, as I was ensured that they were inhabited, especially along the coast, by a kind of savages, and that there were neither roads for carriages nor inns. Undoubtedly, the chief towns of those counties are more civilized. So again, we have this notion of the more distant you are from the metropolitan civilization, the more savage you must be. So by the time we come to the territory that is covered by ATU Mayo, we can see there's basically a blank space. And this is the land of the savages. This is part of that idea. 1776 is also obviously the year of the American War of Independence breaking out. So that idea that actually the colonial empire is about to be broken on some level, that also begins to seep into the consciousness. The turmoil of the French Revolution is coming in. The interesting thing about Twiss's book is that it's published with a map that features some of the elements of the sublime in it. One of the things, this is supposedly a depiction of the Giant's Causeway up in the north of Ireland. Doesn't look really anything like that, but anyway, that's kind of the notion. Other element is the Round Tower, which at that period were still thought to have been Zoroastrian fire towers by immigrants from Persia. There was supposedly a Persian phase of control of Ireland at that time. Then you have the dramatic mountains and lakes, And above all, you have the Irish elk, which is an extinct species of giant elk whose skulls and antlers are occasionally found in bogs and became a real source of fascination, particularly for English antiquaries at the time. So you have this kind of idea. So again, we're back to this notion of space and place and landscape. And W.J.T. Mitchell, who was really an art theorist, sorry, he describes space, place, and landscape as being a dialectical triad. It's a conceptual structure that can be activated from several different angles, which is hopefully what I've been doing here today. And if a place is a specific location, a space then is a practiced place, a site activated by movements, actions, narratives, and signs. Architects, for example, talk about spaces. And then a landscape is that site encountered as an image or a site. So again, it's this kind of framed view, that kind of notion. And Mitchell's aim in his book was to reframe landscape as a verb, asking that we think of landscape not as an object to be seen or a text to be read, but a process by which social and subjective identities are to be formed. Um, and the key thing is that there are two main accesses that we can think about this. One is the framed pictorial landscape, this idea of the site. But the other one is this verbal idea, the notion of landscape as community, as a byproduct of people simply working and living, sometimes coming together, sometimes staying apart, but always recognizing their interdependence. So what I want to do just in final section really is just have a quick look at some images of Ireland and the notion of Ireland in art. And this is a late 19th century painting within the English kind of academic tradition, vaguely post-impressionist. And again, it's the West Coast of Clare. It is the wildness is picked up on by Nathaniel Hone, who was Irish painter, but Dublin based, spent a lot of his career in London, so would be in that sense metropolitan. Um, the ideology of the new nation state in the 1920s was authenticated by the landscape in which it was rooted, in turn implying that the native character, untamed, independent, enduring, was both formed by and analogous to the environment that supported it. And a turning point in the depiction of the Irish landscape, and it established a canon for the imagining of the West in particular that still resounds in visual interpretations today. So this idea that the Irish resistance, so to speak, were expelled to Connacht, where they merged and mixed with the local population, who were the savages, and this was somehow the real Ireland. And that became the archetypal image, particularly after independence in 1922. This notion that this is somehow the real Ireland. And you get these landscapes. First of all, a couple of things to point out. They're treeless. And then secondly, there are no people. The only evidence of inhabitation is a cluster of little small houses. And this became the popular image of Ireland, that it was empty. It was a fresh place. It was, in a sense, to use a term, auto-exoticized. It was made foreign for itself. That actually somehow Irishness was strange even to most Irish people themselves. Don't forget, most Irish people did not live remotely in this kind of landscape. Most Irish people lived in towns and cities. They were an urban population, but this was the image of Ireland that was sold. These paintings by Paul Henry, and then in early movies, Robert Flaherty, The Man of Arran, again, The Islanders, and they're filmed as if it's a documentary of their daily lives, but in fact, it's the daily lives of people from at least a generation before. And there is this, again, this kind of man versus nature kind of idea, this kind of romanticization of Irish life. This was satirized to a certain extent. This is a reconstruction by Sean Lynch of Joseph Beuys, the German artist and founder of the Green Party. And he made this famous artwork, Irish Energy. It's some Irish butter sandwiched in between two turf briquettes, which is kind of, symbolic and parodic at the same time. But it is part of this, again, this notion of the strangeness of Ireland, being one of the few parts of Europe that was not under the control of the Roman Empire. The Romans never came to Ireland. It is also one of the few parts of Ireland that was directly colonized in the same manner as many other colonies in the world, and yet later became kind of a home country of the British Empire. After the Act of Union, it was kind of absorbed into it. So we have this very ambivalent cultural contradictions going on between Ireland and the rest of Europe, and Ireland and being white, and so on and so on. There's lots of history going on there. And this conflict between authority and rebelliousness and the landscape, it still goes on. This is an incident from during the collapse after the crash. There was a bank, Anglo-Irish bank collapsed, and there was a builder based in Achill who loans had collapsed. So as a protest, he built this, a kind of a pseudo replica of Stonehenge built in mass concrete up on the top of a hill in Achill, again, an island on the very far west coast. It was constructed over a weekend, and a team of workers built a road, hauled the large concrete slabs up the hill and sank them into the bog. The local council obviously requested a court order to force him to remove it. It had been built without any permission. He claimed it was exempt from planning as being an ornamental garden. The court ruled against him, but it still remains despite its illegal status. So again, a symbol of contestation. So just to very briefly recap, I know I went over a lot of territory there quite quickly, but we began with the glimpse at landscape and art, and particularly these ideas of the sublime and the picturesque. And then the notion of the role of the landscape in the construction of the colony, particularly in Ireland, was explored. And these concepts of native and alien, who belongs where, who does the land belong to, who belongs in the land, these kind of ideas. And then I looked at a bit of the questioning of landscape and history into the modern era, with the focus on the erasure of history through nature. If we think of the Bia Shade, the people, these minority groups, the Lemkos and Boykos, who are living in this area, and their history is wiped and nature is restored through the growing of the forest. And then finally, we looked very briefly at, again, ideas of authenticity, what's real and what's kind of strange, the auto-exotic, through very briefly examining some images of the Irish landscape. So I just hope I opened up some kind of areas of thought for you there, maybe things you hadn't previously thought about, and thank you. Okay, so that's us.